Magical Realism in Gabriel García Márquez's Chronicle of a Death Foretold, a podcast by Dr. Daryl Barclay. Introduction. The 1981 novella Chronicle of a Death Foretold by Colombian author Gabriel García Márquez is notable for its use of the literary technique known as magical realism. The main purpose here is to create a surreal effect around details and events that would otherwise be quite ordinary. Magical realism usually takes the form of anecdotal digressions or information that may appear superfluous, unusual, strange, inconsistent, or irrelevant. In such texts, it is not the role of the narrator to confirm or deny the existence of any magical or surreal elements. They are written so as to speak for themselves. The writer's aim in this instance is a postmodern one, to reject and subvert the binarisms, rationalisms, and reductive materialism of Western modernity. The term magical realism was first coined by Franz Roh, a German art critic and historian who, in 1930s Europe, undertook a study of the surrealist movement in art. Surrealism is a cultural movement which arose after World War I, in which the rational and logical yield to the unconscious mind. Visual or textual narratives which may be described as magical are significantly indebted to the influence of surrealism, which adopts an oppositional stance towards reality by allowing the subconscious to dominate and the hidden to emerge. Magical realism is closely related to the dreamlike depictions of expressionist painting. Whereas Roh was focused mainly on appreciating the magical qualities of ordinary or normal things, writers such as Márquez and Isabel Allende have taken this technique in new directions, which involve elements of fantasy, fabulism, and the supernatural. In magical realism, the supernatural realm melds with the natural familiar world, and the starting point is generally established first as naturalistic. This twofold world of magical realism differs, therefore, from the one-fold world that can be found in fairy tale and fantasy literature, which characteristically use reality as a peripheral or referential construct. As late 19th century and early 20th century Latin American writers became progressively dissatisfied with the inherited diegetic modes of realism and naturalism, they looked to redefine their narrative forms. This began with the appropriation of the technique known as marvelous realism, which was developed by Cuban novelist Alejo Carpentier. This literary approach exploits the notion that the history, culture, and geography of Latin America appear to be so unusual and incredible that they border on the fictional, supernatural, and magical. There is, therefore, a kind of liminality or interstitiality in the continent's experience that stretches the bounds of conventional thought and narrative modes. In Carpentier's most famous novel, The Lost Steps, the protagonist, who is a composer and musicologist working in New York, journeys from his mundane life in the Big Smoke to a forest and village in South America in search of various primitive musical instruments. In the process, he wanders into a world of lost time and strange miracles. This trope of the civilized Westerner stumbling upon a culture which possesses the secrets of life and the universe reflects the historical experience of the Spanish conquistadores and underpins a culture in which the supernatural has always thrived. Márquez himself told The Atlantic magazine in 1973 that, quote, "Surrealism comes from the reality of Latin America. It runs through the streets," unquote. He was also influenced as a child by his grandmother's imaginative way of telling stories, which often involved ghosts, premonitions, omens, portents, and the supernatural. Quote, "She told things that sounded supernatural and fantastic, but she told them with complete naturalness," unquote. When asked by the writer Plinio Apuleo Mendoza in his book The Fragrance of Guava, Conversations with Gabriel García Márquez, whether he considers several magical realist instances in this text real or imaginary, Márquez replied, quote, "I believe the imagination is just an instrument for producing reality, and the source of creation is always, in the last instance, reality," unquote. Marvelous realism and magical realism are terms that are sometimes used interchangeably, but they can reflect subtle differences in meaning and usage depending on the context and the specific literary work employing them. While marvelous realism tends to explore the extraordinary in a more deliberate or conscious way, magical realism presents the fantastical in a matter-of-fact way, as if it is a natural and integral part of the quotidian world. The supernatural is thus seamlessly woven into the fabric of reality, and characters often treat these magical or extraordinary occurrences as unremarkable. Another key difference is that magical realism is more specifically associated with Latin American literature, whereas marvelous realism can refer to similar techniques used in literature from various parts of the world. The key commonality between both is the blending of the real and the magical, the ordinary and the extraordinary, creating a sense of wonder and exploration of more profound literary themes. Whatever the case, it is clear that marvelous realism provides a foundation and inspiration for writers such as Márquez in his use of magical realism. Using Chronicle of a Death Foretold, let's look now at three main categories which cover the ways in which magical realism is deployed in Márquez's novella. The treatment of myths. The treatment of myths. Myths are treated differently in magical realist texts from their treatment in conventional narratives, where they usually evolve in a linear form. In the magical realist texts, however, myths are reworked so as to be brought into synchronous alignment with later or previous events. In this way, they become a structural device for expressing and interpreting an ontology that is fluid and even at times disjunctive. In the Latin American context, several myths relating to the Mayas and Incas are reworked in magical realist texts so that their meanings can evolve and respond to changing social situations. This approach can also call into question the veracity and validity of the myths themselves. In Chronicle of a Death Foretold, grand historical narratives are replaced with an exploration of the myths which pervade the more microcosmic cultural identity and fabric of a small town. The narrative is thus more concerned with the personal and community aspects of the characters' lives, rather than with broader historical myths. However, the novel still touches upon some historical and political realities of the time. For example, the presence of the Vicario twins in the military and their return home to regain honor for their family reflects the influence of societal expectations and the military culture of the era, with its own hegemonic and hypermasculine mythologies. The story is set in a specific historical context, likely around the mid-20th century, and there are references to political and social dynamics such as the role of the church and the influence of the upper class. The Portraying of Locales. A locale is a place where something happens or is set, or that has particular events or characteristics associated with it. There is a strong connection in Chronicle of a Death Foretold between magical realism and the use of a range of locales, since the genre of magical realism is often used by writers as a mode of restoring their nation's pre-colonized past through the mechanism of post-colonial discourse. Latin American narratives of this kind tend to emphasize regional events and mythologies involving unnatural happenings, and strange dreams in connection with the historical and political dimensions of the region. Márquez has consciously used the locales in Chronicle of a Death Foretold to highlight not only key incidents, but also the ways of perceiving them. Moreover, it is possible to relate these locales to many other developing countries. For example, the small Colombian community with its Arab and Christian races portrayed in Chronicle of a Death Foretold can be related to numerous other such communities with mixed populations and diverse belief systems. The code of honor that features in the novella echoes the community consciousness of many other nations, where there are stringent religious and cultural rules and regulations. In this sense, Márquez's use of the novella's locales can be viewed as a progress from the particular to the universal. The community consciousness depicted in Chronicle of a Death Foretold is universal in that there are similar communities in many of the Caribbean, African, and other post-colonial nations. In the novella, Angela Vicario's personal shame thus becomes a universal shame which hungers for justice. The violent act of the Vicario brothers in murdering Santiago Nassar is the universal drama enacted in many of these communities where vengeance underpins the dominant community consciousness. The depiction of time. The first sentence of Chronicle of a Death Foretold immediately brings into focus the ambiguity of time. Quote, "On the day they were going to kill him, Santiago Nassar got up at 5:30 in the morning to wait for the boat the bishop was coming in." Unquote. The death which functions as the novella's expository core has already occurred, and the narrator is chronicling this almost 3 decades later. By establishing the fact of Santiago Nassar's death at the very beginning of his novella, Márquez provides the narrator with the freedom to deviate chronologically from the unravelling of events, which further broadens the scope for the use of magical realism. In terms of narrative structure, Chronicle of a Death Foretold pursues a circuitous path towards an inevitable end, which is foreknown not only by the narrator, but also by all the novella's panoply of idiosyncratic characters. This erratic and irregular movement between events which occur before, during, and after the death of Santiago poses questions about the imminence of fatality and the possibility of foreknowledge playing a role in subverting an otherwise likely outcome. Márquez's representation of the irrationality of death in this novella is enhanced by his treatment of time as paratactical or fragmentary and of events as asynchronous. The narrator's attempt at chronicling the murder in a linear fashion is frequently undermined by digressions, anecdotes, and other related happenings. At the heart of the journalist's aim is a desire to make sense of the murder and at the same time to find a way of changing the future in the process. Structurally, the narrator opens his account with a description of how Santiago Nassar spent his last few hours alive, but suddenly jumps to the story of how Angela and Bayardo met and follows this with the details which lead to the murder, leaping from there to the years following the murder. This act of aftertelling allows the narrator to examine the events from outside, thereby giving him a privileged view of the physical and metaphysical forces at play. It should be clear now that magical realism manifests itself in a variety of ways in Chronicle of a Death Foretold, and that this creates a degree of complexity as well as surprising readers at times. Here are 10 different examples of magical realism from Márquez's text in the order in which they appear. Example 1. Narrative voice. From the outset, just how the story of Chronicle of a Death Foretold is conveyed to the reader and by whom are foundational elements which Márquez has chosen to subject to the influence of magical realism. The novella's point of view is technically first person or homodiegetic, yet we never know the narrator's name, although we discover progressively that he is the son of Luisa Santiago and the brother of Margot, Luis Enrique, and James, which makes him Angela Vicario's distant cousin. He is also a good friend of Santiago Nassar. Normally, a first-person narrator is regarded as unreliable due to having a limited knowledge of the thoughts and motivations of other characters. This kind of narrator is embedded situationally in the text and able only to recount events and experiences. In Chronicle of a Death Foretold, however, the narrator can also describe what other people are thinking, as well as revealing their subconscious thoughts and fears. This unusual mixture also affects the novella's narrative structure, which, although the narrator's intention is to present a chronicle of events implying a sense of order and sequence, the result is a fragmented style based on a multi-perspectivalist approach. The expectation raised by the novella's very title is undermined by this approach, which sees the key elements of the plot recounted 5 times, once in each of the chapters. The resulting destabilization of the storyline allows for a free and apparently spontaneous interplay of fantasy and reality. Example 2. Santiago's Dreams and Placida Linero. From the outset, Chronicle of a Death Foretold draws on an abundance of foreshadowing and symbolism. By only the second sentence, the narrator introduces Santiago Nassar's dreams, immediately drawing us into the abstract workings of the character's subconscious. Here, the use of his mother as the medium for recounting the dream establishes her too as an agent in the novel's pervasive discourse around the surreal and supernatural. According to Placida Linero, who is recalling these details 27 years after her son's murder, Santiago Nassar was, quote, always dreaming about trees, unquote. The dream in this case ends badly for him, although the second dream involving a, quote, tinfoil airplane, unquote, is more suggestive of invincibility. The narrator then draws out a surprising irony when, having described Placida Linero as a reputedly, quote, accurate interpreter of other people's dreams, unquote, he adds that she, quote, hadn't noticed any ominous augury in those two dreams of her sons, unquote. Moreover, Santiago himself is blind to their possible significance for him. Here, Márquez is working on the assumption that the reader can actually draw conclusions from the symbolism of the dreams, but those who should ostensibly be even clearer about this actually remain surprisingly ignorant. Example 3. The Bishop's Arrival. On page 15, the author describes an incident when the bishop's boat approaches the shore. Quote, it appeared at the bend in the river, snorting like a dragon, and then the band of musicians began to play the bishop's anthem, and the cocks began to crow in their baskets and arouse the other roosters in town, unquote. The evocative and surreal simile of the snorting dragon captures the clerical power and egotism of the bishop as an authority figure in the institutional church. This magical realist depiction is also a satire on the clerical class, since the clergy prove ineffective in preventing the murder of Santiago Nassar. Ironically, the bishop has come to deliver a blessing, but chooses to do so from afar without setting foot in the town. As God's representative, he appears to have snubbed the town, in a gesture which suggests that even he is aware of the God-forsakenness of these people and the toxicity of their culture. He literally turns his back on the people when he begins, quote, to make the sign of the cross in the air opposite the crowd on the pier, and he keeps on doing it mechanically afterwards without malice or inspiration, unquote. Here, the meaninglessness of the ritual gesture underlines the bishop's desire to disassociate himself from these people. Example 4. The Birds. Seeking to exploit the well-established parallels between Greek tragedy and birds as omens or auguries, Márquez populates Chronicle of a Death Foretold with frequent ambiguous and evocative references to birds of various breeds. The novella's epigraph references falcons, which are birds of prey possessing exceptional visual acuity and able to fly at extremely high speeds. Santiago Nassar himself is a falconer, which makes him someone who deals with a potentially deadly force. In this way, his own demise is foreshadowed even from the first pages of the novella, when birds appear in a dream on the morning of his death and spatter him with excrement. Ironically, even Placida Linero, a woman renowned as an interpreter of dreams, is unable to find any, quote, ominous augury, unquote, in Santiago's dreams. And the narrator himself adds, quote, nor did Santiago Nassar recognize this omen, unquote. Divina Flor tells the narrator that when the bishop's boat had stopped tooting, quote, the cocks began to crow. It was such a great uproar that I couldn't believe there were so many roosters in town, and I thought they were coming on the bishop's boat, unquote. The narrator tells us that when the band of musicians began to play the bishop's anthem, the cocks began to crow in their baskets and aroused all the other roosters in town. This uproar continues even when the boat has disappeared from view. Márquez's birds are an actual physical presence in the novella, but their behavior and symbolic function support a reading of them as ambiguous and representational. At one level, the crowing cocks metaphorically represent betrayal and allude to chapter 14 of the Gospel of Mark, when Peter denies that he ever knew Jesus, and hearing the cock crow, immediately remembers his master's prediction that he would eventually deny ever knowing him. The crowing of the cocks and the awakening of the other roosters in the town creates a disturbing and unnerving cacophony which further acts as a portent of chaos. Example 5. Margot. On page 19, we are told that the narrator's sister Margot, quote, seemed to have threads of communication with the other people in town, especially those her age, and sometimes she would surprise us with news that was ahead of its time, which she could only have known through powers of divination, unquote. Margot's psychic and supernatural abilities align her with the dark arts and distinguish her from the ordinary everyday townsfolk. Her unique foreknowledge of events is another way in which Márquez distorts the linearity of time to undermine conventional temporality in the novella. Her powers of divination also connect directly with the novella's title and the concept of something dire that is foretold, but remains inevitable. But they do so once again in an ironic way. Like Placida Linero, who can interpret dreams but failed to understand the import of two that her son had experienced, Margot, quote, was one of the few people who still didn't know that they were going to kill him, unquote. Márquez suspends her powers of divination to subvert any rational assumptions about possible intervention in the murder. The narrator underlines this dissonance by reflecting that, quote, it was strange that she hadn't known, unquote, adding that it was even stranger that, quote, his own mother didn't know either, unquote. Example 6. Bayardo san Román. Magical realism can also underpin the delineation of a character, as in the case of Bayardo san Román, whom we meet in chapter 2. Márquez immediately establishes a binary with this character, who is mythicized by the use of supernatural elements. On page 25, we are told that, according to Magdalena Oliver, he, quote, looked like a fairy, unquote, while on page 27, the narrator's mother says, quote, he reminded me of the devil, unquote. He is frequently referred to as strange and mysterious. Legends are created around him which are borrowed from fantastical narratives used to construct him as a larger-than-life persona. Oral narratives are circulated in the community which idealize and lionize him. Quote, it came to be said that he had wiped out villages and sown terror in Casanare as troop commander, that he had escaped from Devil's Island, unquote. This form of mythicization represents Bayardo as the powerful patriarchal outsider whose rejection of Angela Vicario is so immediate and extreme. The elements of strangeness and mysteriousness contribute to this image of the outsider. The summative legend about him is that, quote, he was capable of doing everything, and doing it quite well, but also had access to endless resources, unquote. Example 7. The Accusation. When the Vicario brothers arrive home at 3 a.m. and find Angela face down on the dining room couch, having been rejected by her husband of only a few hours, their priority becomes finding out to whom she had previously lost her virginity. The scene is a mixture of predictable dialogue and surreal psychological insights. Angela herself feels, quote, as if the drowsiness of death had finally been lifted from her, unquote, and that all she wants to do is to, quote, flop down and go to sleep, unquote. Trembling with rage, Pedro demands that she, quote, tell us who it was, unquote. The narrative on page 47 then moves into a kind of free indirect discourse in which it is unclear whether an omniscient voice is allowing us access to Angela's subconscious, or whether she explained her experience to the narrator in these terms, or even whether the narrator is using poetic license to imagine what the moment of interrogation was like for her. Quote, she only took the time necessary to say the name. She looked for it in the shadows. She found it at first sight among the many, many easily confused names from this world and the other, and she nailed it to the wall with her well-aimed dart, like a butterfly with no will, whose sentence has always been written. Santiago Nassar, she said. Unquote. The otherworldliness of this passage is typical of how magical realism can move a text's diegesis beyond literal or even metaphorical meaning into a liminal zone with a new form of symbolic language. In a practical sense, it is also essential at this point that Santiago Nassar's name not emerge out of any kind of certainty, reliability, or rationality. Example 8. The jail cell. In Chapter 4, the Vicario brothers are locked in a jail cell while the mayor tries to think on page 78 of, quote, something to do with them, unquote. There are strong parallels with the experience of Macbeth after he commits the murder of King Duncan and is unable to sleep and hears a voice cry out, "Sleep no more, Macbeth does murder sleep." The common element here, of course, is guilt. The narrator tells us that, quote, they'd gone 3 nights without sleep, but they couldn't rest because as soon as they began to fall asleep, they would commit the crime all over again, unquote. Ironically, they were still comforted at that moment by, quote, the honour of having done their duty, unquote. Nevertheless, like Lady Macbeth, they must then face the confronting task of washing the blood from their shirts and their arms and their faces. But as the narrator recounts, quote, they couldn't get any rest, unquote. Moreover, their bodies begin to psychosomatically reflect their conflicted psyches. Pedro Vicario progressively loses his strength and becomes very ill, so ill in fact that, quote, the pain in his groin had reached his throat, his urine was shut off, and he suffered the frightful certainty that he wouldn't sleep ever again for the rest of his life, unquote. Pedro tells the narrator, quote, I was awake for 11 months, unquote, with the narrator adding to this hyperbole, quote, I knew him well enough to know that it was true, unquote. Rationally, it is very unlikely that anyone could stay awake for 11 months straight, but the point here is that Márquez is using this exaggerated commentary to convey the intensity of Pedro's pain, while simultaneously raising questions about the veracity of this account and undermining the reliability of the narrator himself. Example 9. The Light at Sea. On the eve of his murder, Santiago Nassar is about to leave the house of Maria Alejandrina Cervantes. On page 67, the narrator explains that, quote, the moon was high in the sky and the air was clear, and at the bottom of the precipice you could see the trickle of light from St. Elmo's fire in the cemetery, unquote. St. Elmo's fire is a blue glow caused by plasma, a state of matter with charged ions, that appears near pointy objects during storms. It has been documented and recorded as far back as classical antiquity. Along with moonlight and the phosphorescent glow now appearing on the Caribbean horizon, it creates a supernatural luminescence as context and prelude for the key line in this passage. Quote, Santiago Nassar pointed to an intermittent light at sea and told us that it was the soul in torment of a slave ship that had sunk with a cargo of blacks from Senegal across from the main harbour mouth at Cartagena de Indias, unquote. This eerie reference then shifts the discourse from the supernatural to the psychological when the narrator adds that, quote, it wasn't possible to think that his conscience was bothering him, although at that time he didn't know that the ephemeral married life of Angela Vicario had come to an end 2 hours before, unquote. The narrator's claim that this knowledge wasn't possible functions ambiguously as either a question or an interpretation of the moment based on subsequent reflection. In either case, it destabilizes the narration by adding mysterious details and removing certainty. Example 10. The Clean Knife. A strange heightening of the magical realist narrative occurs across pages 119 to 20, when Pedro Vicario declares to the investigator that, quote, the knife kept coming out clean. I'd given it to him at least 3 times and there wasn't a drop of blood, unquote. Here, the narrative captures the psychological desire of the brothers to be exculpated on the basis of their adherence to the code of honor. The fantasy of the clean knife represents a rationalization of the crime as virtuous and justifiable in response to a subconscious guilt that, from the moral absolutist perspective of Catholicism, killing is always wrong and violates the 5th commandment. A page later, in sharp contrast, we are shown a terribly wounded Santiago Nassar leaning to one side, quote, holding his hanging intestines in his hands, unquote. The body has been so violently butchered that reason would clearly dictate a grossly bloodied knife. The whole recounting of the details of the actual murder is punctuated with similarly contradictory details. Santiago Nassar leaned back against his mother's door, quote, without the slightest resistance, as if he only wanted to help them finish killing him by equal shares, unquote. He did not cry out, according to Pedro Vicario, but looked as if he was laughing. The whole town is shouting, but they fail to hear anything. The precise difficulty in murdering Santiago Nassar and the gory description of his murder are depicted as a social spectacle. This dramatic narration, infused with magical realism, opens up a new area for interpreting and reinterpreting the murder itself and the reasons for it. Conclusion. These are not all of, or the only, manifestations of magical realism in the text, but they allow us an insight into the variety of forms which this technique assumes. Magical realist texts ask us to look beyond the limits of the knowable, or to see with what the poet William Blake called fourfold vision, that is, seeing through something to what lies beyond it. For Márquez, the priority is to displace the dominant narrative so that the hidden narrative may emerge as well. In this regard, he has clearly been successful.